Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Constructive Criticism YouTube channel. I'm Heezy, host of Constructive Criticism, and I'm excited today to talk to you about a deck that I've been working on for like 6 months that for some reason won't go away. Before I do that, I just want to say thank you to everyone over on patreon.com/ccmtg. We got actually Mikey, shout out to Mikey, who's actually watching this live. If you want to watch these deck techs live every week, head on over to patreon.com/ccmtg, become a patron, $5 or more. You'll get access to the Discord where I will be recording these deck techs weekly from now on. But, enough with that. I want to talk about Standard really quickly before I get into this. So, Standard is in a really interesting place where there is clearly a best deck. It's really good against creature decks, and I'm about to do a deck tech on a deck that, while in my last 2 leagues I have beaten that deck, I do not think it has an amazing matchup against Grixis. And I want to say that going into this. Like, if your question is how to beat Grixis, this deck probably isn't the right deck to just beat Grixis, but it is a really good other deck against creature decks that can beat Grixis. So, just want to get that out of the way, and let's get started, and we'll jump right over into the deck tech. So, I'm going to pull up the deck here. Everybody can take a look before I get started. But this is Naya Good Boys, as I like to call it. Naya Good Boys is really a Wolves deck that started before the new set even came out. This was actually a deck that I was working on pre-rotation that I just kept working on for some reason. Really early on, when building decks for the new format, I was actually having a lot of trouble with anything other than like Grixis-y Jund stuff. But I also was finding that I didn't like the mirrors. I wasn't having a lot of fun. And I also wanted a color that was able to find a way to combat that kind of stuff. So some key things in the main deck that you'll notice is we have 4 Planeswalkers, 4 Wandering Emperor, 4 Arlen the Pax Hope. These Planeswalkers actually I would categorize as one key card. The Planeswalkers are a huge part of what this deck is trying to do. When you have a Planeswalker, they're really easy to protect because your creatures often are large. You have a lot of removal spells. They act as removal spells, and they're really able to take over the game by making your things outscale your opponent's things. They also both do a really good job of making it so that you can make it either daytime or nighttime, depending on what phase of the game it is. Wandering Emperor having Flash, surprisingly really good with Werewolves. Your opponent knows what's going to happen, and they have to play around it accordingly. And if they don't know what's about to happen to them, they're in really big trouble. Arlen does a really good job because the plus ability, after you've made those 2 wolves held down the ground, just makes it so that you get to decide whether to cast multiple large creatures in one turn or whether to make it into nighttime. And once it's nighttime, that 5/5 creature with Indestructible Trample takes over the game just as much as anything else. Honestly, I think that these 2 cards make this deck have game against way too many things. They're both really good against aggro. They're both really good against other mid-range decks. They're both obviously insane against things that, if anybody's trying to do control, they're some of the most important cards in the deck. The next most important card in the deck is Reckless Stormseeker. This card is a 2/3 for 3 that at the beginning of your combat, during your turn, it gets +1+. You choose a creature, it gets +1/+0 and haste until end of turn. I top 8'd an RCQ with this deck. The only loss I had all day was actually to the same Grixis player twice. He was the only person playing Grixis in the room, but people were not prepared for this card. They might be more prepared for it now that Mono Red is seeing a little bit more play, but people just really don't expect the amount of damage that can come out of this deck especially when it's a nighttime. Like if it's nighttime and you get to go put down a Tolvar and then give something something else trample too, or if you get if you put down Naturalist, or for heaven's sakes volatile Arsonist, like all of these things, all of the ways that it can use haste damage in different ways, really put your opponent on blast really quickly, because the deck, while being an aggressive deck, right, it has 4 1-drops, 7 2-drops. Most of its curve is in that first 3 cards, those first 3 mana slots. It isn't the typical type of aggro deck. It actually kind of pivots is what it does. It controls the early game if it can. If not, it plays the aggro game. It's like a classic mid-range deck in that sense. It's just really aggressively slanted. And Reckless Stormseeker lets you turn on the jets. And it is really important for that card. It also is important because it means that if you want to pivot in sideboarding where you know you're not supposed to be the aggressor, it's a really easy out for this deck, which I think would surprise a lot of people. People would think, oh, I'm never going to side this card out if it's one of the most important cards. That's actually not true. There are lots of matchups where you're sideboarding a lot of cards, and you know either whether you're on the draw or whether it's not a matchup where Reckless Stormseeker is good, that those are the things coming out. And finally, kind of the last key card I would say is Tezzik Naturalist. It would be easy to say like Outland Liberator or even the Tolvar, but Tezzik Naturalist does this thing where it allows you to to pull ahead on mana quickly. It is a must answer threat. And then between the number of 2-drops that you have, making it so that daytime or nighttime becomes a thing quickly is actually really important in the deck, where you'd much rather have a hand with one of your 2-drops than almost anything else in the deck. Naturalist, being a Lord on one side is actually really key when you think about something like Reflection of Kiki-Jiki. The number of times where I copy this just to pump the whole team is most of the time. You would think that, you'd copy another Stormseeker, or you think that you'd copy, something really large. Now, the thing that you're copying is usually Lord of Uvenwald, because it's going to make your team so much bigger and make you so much mana, especially if you have like another Trollvar in play that you can use that mana to wolf run them out of the game. The mana is really interesting. I think the number of people that would look at this mana base and be like, what is going on? You have caught on to something really interesting. This mana is kind of tough. Naya has great lands, but a lot of them are these tap lands, right? These Rockfell Vale farmlands and Sundowns. This means that if I focus my mana, I need to focus it where I can easily play a 2-drop or a 1-drop in turns where I have an early tap land, but I still am able to always be able to play my 3-drops. So the solution to that was actually Thran's Portal. This is the 5-color fast land, and it's fixed a lot of problems. It actually really makes it so Wandering Emperor isn't a problem for this deck, as you might guess. It looks like it would be, because you get to that 12, 13 white sources, as well as having treasure from Fable of the Mirrorbreaker. If you didn't have Thran's Portal, you wouldn't actually be able to play white cards reliably, in my opinion, or at least your mana would be a lot worse to be able to do so. So the mana base consists of 2 spell lands in Boseiju and Uadurs and the Seat of the Emperor. There was a time where I was actually playing 3 spell lands and 1 less Jetsmere Garden. I was actually playing one of the red ones. The red one, while you would think would be really good, this deck actually just isn't as aggressive as it looks like it is on paper. So the 1/1s don't tend to matter as much. So that actually became another garden, being able to draw a card with your excess mana, being able to pass the turn just in the same way that you would with the red spell land was pretty important. We have 1 mountain, 3 forests, 4 Keshbin forests, 3 Rockville Vales, 1 Sundown Pass, 3 overgrown farmland, 4 gardens, and 4 Thran's Portal. Honestly, the mana is pretty strong in this deck. Because it's a 3-color deck, though, you'll find that like some number of the time you're going to need to mulligan because you don't have exactly the lands that you need. I find this deck mulligans really well. Also, the fact that you have things like Fable of the Mirrorbreaker and Cathartic Pyre let you kind of cycle through your unnecessary cards. This deck plays 25 lands, which sounds like a lot, but some of these spell lands are actually just acting as spells for you to pass your turn with, as much as they are lands, including the cycle lands here. So it may look like a lot, but it is to make sure that you have the lands that you need and that you're able to have enough instant speed interaction things to use your werewolves effectively. The coolest interaction in this deck, I kind of mentioned one of them. It's usually Fable of the Mirrorbreaker stuff, but honestly, like the ability to instant speed out a whole bunch of creatures with Arlen and just make it nighttime, if that's never happened to you before, you're probably going to be really surprised the first time that your opponent goes, okay, plus Arlen, and they'll be like, okay, well, what do I do? Like, you attack Arlen here, it's like, well, now I have multiple options. Like, I can flash in a bunch of stuff to block you, including, removal spells. Like, well, you actually can't do it with Cathar because of the backside. We should actually talk about that. But, I had a game yesterday where my opponent wrathed me. I had an Arlen in play. I plussed Arlen past the turn, and then went to -20 the next turn. I mean, it's just the number of power you're able to quickly put into play with that +1 is absolutely unbelievable. And then on the other side, she's just a 5/5 indestructible haste trampler. Some of the other cool interactions, as I've obviously mentioned, Wandering Emperor plussing on stuff. But I also think that just, Fable of the Mirrorbreaker, there's a lot of really good options for Fable of the Mirrorbreaker, Reflection of Higijiki, where you're able to, quickly turn the tables and pivot really easily. Also, the fact that Valorous Stance both protects your aggressive creatures and kills the dumbest creature ever in Sheldred, really important. So those are kind of some of the key stuff in the main deck, things that you're looking for. The sideboard, we have a second Tamiyo Safekeeping. This comes in so much. I'm almost getting to the point where I'm almost back to 2 Tamiyo Safekeeping main deck just because of the Grixis decks, just because of this. One of the things, though, is we mentioned that a lot of our cards cost 3 mana. So in a lot of aggressive decks, even the mono green decks, you would easily be able to wait a turn to play something for Tamiyo Safekeeping. Because of the way the Grixis deck plays out, while that can be a fine play, it is not as impactful as it was in something like mono green, because they're also going to play a 2-drop and a 3-drop. It makes it a lot harder, where this needs to become a lot bigger and more important, and also because some of their key plays involve you sacrificing stuff. Still really good, though. Obliterating Bolt is the newest addition to this deck. It's a huge deal. The number of Planeswalkers that actually get high loyalty across this format, and it's pretty high. It being able to do that instead of playing something like Lightning Strike, while Lightning Strike's instant speed is helpful. Like I said, the deck's just not as aggressive as you would think it is, and Obliterating Bolt is just a much better removal spell, even though it can't flip your stuff. Reckoning Bankbuster is next. We have 2 of those. Really good with Werewolves, lets you draw a bunch of extra cards, use your excess mana, and lets you decide when you want to flip your Werewolves. Howling Moon is a recent addition to the deck. This is something that I ended up playing at the RCQ that I really liked. Pretty good against both aggressive decks and decks that are trying to catch up to you. Howling Moon, being able to make your guys really big and then continue to put things onto the board as you pressure your opponent, kind of pivots really well. Totally could see not playing this card depending on how things work out in the meta game. If there aren't a lot of decks that need to double spell to catch up, or if Esper, for example, decreases in popularity, this card gets a lot worse. You get a third Wandering Emperor for moments where you got to sideboard into a little bit of a bigger game plan. Another Valorous Stance, mostly for Sheldred stuff. Rending Flames, also mostly for Sheldred stuff. Just being able to kill big creatures is really important. I have a third Brutal Cathar. This card has been hit or miss. There are sometimes where it's one of the best cards in your deck, sometimes where it's not. Cemetery Prowler is our graveyard hate card. It's able to come down, eat something so that your opponent can't care about those things as much, as well as ramp you if you want to. It also is pretty good against aggro if you want to be more of a mid-rangey deck, hold down the ground with the next 4. And then Averbrook Caretaker has just won me an inappropriate number of games lately. The number of people that don't see this coming, you just start pumping your entire team on Nightbound side. It's way too good. I actually used to have the other 6-drop in here as well. This card was just better, and comes in the right spots where you would think you would want it. So this deck plays differently on the play or the draw a lot. If you're on the draw, sometimes you'll be sideboarding out your pack leaders. You're also sideboarding out your pack leaders in matchups where you're not very aggressive. In those slots, you're bringing in things like Bankbuster or removal spells. And the games where you're being aggressive, you're bringing in things like Safekeeping or maybe even Valorous Stance, depending on if you're trying to protect your stuff. We've already talked about, what Cemetery Prowler is doing. Caretaker, there's a lot of matchups where maybe you're not trying to be super aggressive, and so you actually board out your arsonists directly for the caretakers. But there's also matchups where you're trying to go really big, where you keep them both in. And also it could be depending on the player or the draw, as I said. That's something that's really important to this. If this video gets 15 likes, I'll actually go ahead and make a sideboard guide available, and give you those direct answers. Against control decks, there's not a lot of them right now, but you're basically just bringing in your Wandering Emperor, your Reckoner Bankbuster, while still staying aggressive. This means that, some of your removal spells like Obliterating Bolt or Cathartic Pyre may be coming out, maybe even the Valorous Stance, depending on their build, and the Brutal Cathars. Brutal Cathar comes out quite a bit. I've already mentioned some of the other comes out quite a bit in Reckless Stormseeker and Pack Leader. And then the other one that comes out quite often is Arsonist, depending on the play or the draw or the sizing that you're trying to achieve. Kind of thinking about cards moving forward, if there's anything that you could add to this deck, if you want to be more aggressive, you can go back to playing Lightning Strikes. If you do that, I would recommend playing something like Pup. Ferocious Pup scales really well, gets really bigger, lets you attack for a lot of damage. The other things that you could do is, if you wanted to maybe go a little smaller, play 24 lands, you could cut the Arsonist, play a land to the sideboard, maybe play another Arlen in the main deck, stuff like that. The things that you want to play against most with this deck are just other creature decks. As long as they don't have... So what's funny is Red-Black is actually a good matchup for you, while Grixis is a little bit worse. And the reason for that is actually just Corpse Appraiser. Like, Corpse Appraiser is just insanely good against you as a creature deck. And then, so being able to both kill Corpse Appraiser, being able to sequence your stuff around Corpse Appraiser is really important. But basically, any other creature deck you're actually really happy playing against. Like, I love playing against Esper with this deck. I love playing against Red-Black. I love playing against Mono Black. It is basically just the Grixis version that you have trouble with. And then you're really good against the aggressively slanted decks as long as you understand how to use your mana, because your mana is a little bit painful with 4 Careship and Force and 4 Thrunt's Portal. Other than that, like, there's not really decks that you hate to play against. I think that your plans in the matchups, we've kind of talked about most of those, but this deck has a lot of game. People aren't expecting you to come out and just attack them with Werewolves and be able to get so much mana quickly between Fable the Mirrorbreaker and Naturalist. They especially aren't expecting like the 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop plan that scales into a 4-drop Planeswalker into a 5-drop. I mean, you win all of those games where you just literally curve out. But yeah, that's kind of it for this deck. If you have questions, leave a comment in the YouTube channel. Happy to answer anything that anybody has. This deck is really strong, really fun to play, and I put a lot of work into it. So if you have questions, leave them there. Like I said, if we get those likes, I'll make a sideboard guide, and I'll post it in a comment on the YouTube channel. Don't forget to check out the rest of the Constructive Criticism Network, whether that be Constructive Criticism. We have Mythic Cast coming back. You've got Sam Black's Drafting Archetypes, and then soon a return of Common Knowledge. You can find me at Spencer13H. Don't forget to like this video as well as the rest of the stuff going around. And if you get the chance, hit that subscribe button. It really helps out the channel. And we'll see you guys all next week with another deck talk here on the Constructed Criticism YouTube channel.